Welcome back. Today we're going to glance over the graphical settings of Helldivers 2 and their effects on the game, some bonus settings that may or may not help with performance, and lastly, test the graphical presets with my setup to see how each preset holds up framerate wise. Knowing all that, let's start with the settings themselves. This section is simply about testing out each setting, what it changes, and how much it affects FPS. First option we can change is display mode. Here we have three options to choose from: windowed, borderless window, and full screen. It doesn't change anything about how the game looks, but it gives you the choice between being able to alt-tab easily out of the game or gain slightly more FPS. I should also mention that in full screen mode, sometimes when you tab out of the game, it locks up in this limbo state where it tries to refocus onto a different app window, but it fails and tries again and again, forcing you into forcefully quitting the game. This can happen even when a notification from an app pops up and you clicked on it by an accident. On the positive side, choosing full screen will grant you around 2 to 4 frames per second. So it entirely depends on what you need the most, slightly more FPS or the ability to alt-tab properly out of the game. For the rest of the testing, I will be choosing borderless window so I can easily play around with the settings and tab out of the game if I need to. The last option we're going to check out in the display tab is render scale. This setting has the biggest effect on frame rate in the whole game. What it does is it takes your resolution that you set the game to render to, in my case it's 4K, and depending on the preset you choose, the game renders at a set percentage of your original resolution. So just as an example, if I set the resolution to 2160p and the balance preset is 66% of my original resolution, then the game will render at 1440p. That image is then upscaled back to the original resolution. The lower the scale is, the better frame rates you can expect. Of course, at the expense of clarity. The huge benefit this has over just lowering your resolution is that the UI of the game is preserved at the original resolution, so any text that isn't a texture in the game world will stay sharp. Now back to the game, we have so many presets to choose from ultra performance to ultra. All of these lower the resolution and then upscale it. The scale ranges from 33% to around 90% of the original resolution. The next option is native. This is essentially the original image without any modifications to it. And lastly, super sampling and ultra super sampling. Unlike the first options, where it lowered the rendering resolution, this raises it and then downscales it to the original. Unless you have extra horsepower to use or an already low native resolution, I don't suggest using them. The rest, however, it entirely depends on your setup and your needs. Moving forward, I will be using the quality preset. And with that, let's slide onto the graphics tab, starting with the option motion blur. As the name suggests, it affects how blurry objects get during movement. This is purely a subjective choice if you want to have it turned on or off, but it does have a very slight effect on performance. One thing I will mention is that you will have the same FPS no matter the strength you set it to. Personally, I like this effect a lot, so in normal gameplay I do have it turned on, but due to the nature of this video, I want to keep the clarity as high as possible. So motion blur is going to be turned off for the rest of the video. The next effect is depth of field. When turned on, everything that is behind what the crosshair is currently aiming at, it blurs it, and everything too close to the camera is also blurred. Basically, it tries to emulate how cameras and our eyes focus. I like this effect a lot, and it almost doesn't cost you any performance, so I suggest you leaving it on. But for this video, it will be turned off for the same reasons I gave before. Right after, we have bloom. This setting turns on glow around bright objects or light, as well as reflective surfaces. It adds a lot of realism to the scene and can make the image pop a lot more. It has a minuscule effect on performance, so I suggest you just leave it on. The last post-processing effect on the list is sharpness. Depending on the strength you choose, it sharpens the image by that amount. The effect is very subtle at 4K, even at strength set to 1. Like with motion blur, it doesn't matter how strong the effect is, its cost doesn't change, which is around 2 FPS if you have it on. It's entirely subjective, but I will leave it on for the rest of the video. From that, we can move on to textures, which this setting actually doesn't change much. Even after I chose lower VRAM options, the game still took as much memory as my graphics card could allow it. So I suggest just leaving this setting to the amount of memory you have available on your graphics card, which in my case is the option high. Object detail density sets how detailed objects appear in the distance, so for an example it affects the distance when trees turn from models to 2D objects, or in this case, how detailed should the fabricator be. Another example are the mountains in the distance, where at higher settings they appear more detailed. Render distance is similar to object detail density, but it affects at what distance can objects still render. So as shown, the higher the setting is, the more objects are rendered at longer distances. Shadow quality is self-explanatory, but it changes a lot more than you might expect. Starting at the lowest option, the game has very low resolution sun shadows, no shadows are casted from local lights, and self-casting shadows are either non-existent or are very low res and bright. Stepping up to low quality, and there is already a huge improvement. Sun shadows get a healthy bump in resolution, self-casting shadows are now present, but we still don't get any local light shadows. Interestingly, shadows also seem way less filtered and smoothed out than in any other options. Moving on to medium, we finally get shadows from local lights, like in the ship or in the game world. This, however, doesn't include lights from explosions, gunfire, or any dynamically made lights. This is also true for the rest of the options. But back to medium quality, sun shadows are still the same resolution as in low, but are now more filtered and smoothed out. Moving on to high, sun shadows get a nice resolution bump and local shadows are slightly higher res, but are still somewhat pixelated. And lastly, ultra, which slightly boosts the quality of local shadows and sun shadows. Particle quality changes the resolution of particles and the amount that can be currently present in the scene. I wasn't able to capture the second effect of the setting, however it is reported that in the difference between lowest and high can be as much as 10 FPS in heavy combat, so I suggest sticking to low or medium since those settings don't affect the resolution of particles as much as the lowest. Reflection quality is another big game changer, where at the lowest settings, reflections are completely disabled. Stepping up to low, static cube maps are used for reflections. Medium is the same story, but the cube maps are higher quality. On high, the game uses SSR for its reflections and cube maps as a backup. This allows way more detailed reflections, with dynamic objects now also visible in them. But since it's only screen space, as soon as the reflected scenery is out of view, it also disappears from the reflection, falling back to the cube maps. Space quality seems to affect very little, because during testing I wasn't able to find the difference it makes, so I suggest just leaving it to low. Ambient occlusion is a screen space effect that creates shadows in occluded areas or on objects that are close to each other. It works on short distances and has a very small cost in performance, so I suggest just leaving it on. Screen space global illumination should simulate how light bounces around in the game world, but due to its screen space limitation, it doesn't seem to do much in my testing, so I suggest just leaving it off. Vegetation and rubble density affects the amount of ground details and the distance they are rendered at. Terrain quality is self-explanatory, it just affects the terrain quality and how bumpy the ground is. Volumetric fog affects the quality of fog and the resolution of God rays. It may seem that the fog quality changes a lot, but that is just due to weather changing in-game. I actually didn't notice much difference between the different presets. The only big difference is in the quality of God rays, with each step making them more defined. Of course, at the cost of performance. The volumetric cloud setting doesn't seem to change anything about the clouds, so I suggest just leaving it on the lowest preset for best performance. The lighting quality setting is pretty unclear about all of the differences it makes, but from what I've found, it seems to change the properties of all materials to make them be affected by more lights. This can be best seen in the ship, where the smaller local lights in the rooms now affect the global lighting and the materials of the ship. Another example I found was with bug holes, which emit secondary lighting that is completely absent at low settings. So I suggest skipping the low option entirely if you don't require the extra FPS that option brings. The last actual setting that has any effect on graphics is anti-aliasing, which seems to function similarly to FXAA, blurring the whole image, removing the jagged edges, but at the cost of overall clarity. Framerate wise, it doesn't make much of a difference, so it's entirely on you what you prefer. And now we move on to the last setting in the graphics tab, which is async compute. Visually, it doesn't change anything, it just changes how some things work under the hood. As mentioned in the description, this setting's effect entirely depends on your setup, so you will have to do some testing on your own. However, with my setup, I did notice a healthy boost to FPS while testing it on the same 5-minute run as you see in the background. Before we move on to the benchmarks, there is one last thing you can change outside of the game. Using this command in Steam's game launch parameters, you can change the renderer from DirectX 12 to DirectX 11. Like the setting async compute, this can have completely different results on your machine, so it's advised that you try this out yourself. However, I will mention that when the game is set to DirectX 11, sometimes launching takes a lot longer than normally, so don't be afraid if you have a black screen for a long time, just be patient. When it launches, it should be the same as if using DirectX 12. While visually it is the same, DirectX 11 yields me way better performance in some cases than in DirectX 12. So I suggest you try it out for yourself. That concludes everything that can be changed about the game. Now we can continue to the next section of this video, which is benchmarking all of the presets that the game has, but also how much the change from DirectX 12 to DirectX 11 changes the FPS we get from each preset. Of course, the benchmark is on the same mission with almost the same conditions each time, so it fairly represents the performance you can expect. I will mention, however, that me recording the footage does slightly lower the performance, so try to compensate for that by adding around 5 to 10 FPS to each metric. With that mentioned, first we'll go over all of the presets running under DirectX 12, then DirectX 11, and lastly, I will add a graph that compares both APIs. So, without stalling this anymore, let's get to benchmarking.
outpost spotted. Prepare to terminate.
Mission at 30 minutes remaining. Sub-objective nearby.
Mag's empty.
That's all! Mag's empty! Mag's empty! Bug outpost spotted. Prepare to terminate.
Orbital barrage incoming. Stand clear.
Northeast. Tagging map. East. Bar. Bug outpost. Tagging map. Northwest. 200 meters.
And that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. You can also tell me if you prefer me dubbing these videos or continue making them like the old ones, with me completely absent. Well, that's all from me. See ya.